and gentlemen, it's Canadiens time. Hello and welcome to Canadiens time, back in the old format, which is now going to be the new format. So a lot has happened. The Habs just lost big to the Florida Panthers tonight. And I guess what you can say about that game is the Habs certainly didn't quit, as they scored 5 goals to at least try to stay in it. And even though that it was pretty much a lost cause, but you got to give the credit to the Canadiens. They still stayed in it and showed a lot of fight. And Sam Montembeault came in, and after that 9th goal was scored, just lock things down. So it's just we want to forget about this game, don't we? Moving on from that, so point that was made on Locked On Canadiens by Scott Matla is that the Habs face a very difficult schedule compared to the teams they're competing with in the low rung of the standings. So it's very possible that the Habs are going to drop a bit because they just have the harder schedule, so that the chances of losing are just higher. But at the same time, Matla pointed out that there's not really going to be a chance to catch some of those really, really bottom dweller teams. And so the tank commanders should be happy that there's a really good chance that the Habs are going to lose a bunch of games, and it's going to still work out that the Habs are going to end up with a relatively good pick. Speaking of the future, though, the Habs Unfiltered crew theorized that after 2 years, the Habs are going to be playoff bound. So I'll be very interested to see if that comes to pass. It would be great if it would happen next year, but it's hard to say, really. I mean, we see sort of obviously the team needs to not be injured. And that'd be nice. I mean, the amount of injuries this team has faced is just ridiculous. So the team has to put a team that's not injured on the ice, and then we'll see what they can really do. But presuming injuries don't become this ridiculous, then, I guess, 2 years seems realistic, and maybe sooner. Also, on the Habby Hour, Beth pointed out that Nick Suzuki has his second 50-point season, and becoming the first Habs player since Saku Koivu to have consecutive seasons with 50-plus points at the age of 23 or younger. So Nick is just a fantastic player, and he's proving it in the stats. Injury-wise, we have so many injuries, but we just saw Tristan Dvorak out for the season with knee surgery, so he is added to the list of players that will not be available. Locked On Canadiens told us that Louis Baudon has been signed for a tryout with the Rocket. Also, Scott Matla believes that Joel Teasdale has earned an NHL shot after his performance with the Rocket. Be interesting to see if he gets it. And of course, will that be under favorable circumstances, or will it be because somebody else get injured? Ian Boisvert on the build has been noting that Jesse Ylönen may be putting things together, as he has 2 goals in the last 2 games when that episode was taped. I do not recall if Ylönen scored tonight versus Florida or not. I'd have to look, and I neglected to do that. So, needless to say, it does look like Ylönen is becoming much more engaged offensively. Marc Dumont had an interesting point about Alex Belzile. He did some stats crunching and found that he's among the top 5 players in the NHL when it comes to 5v5 production in relation to ice time, with 3.08 points per 60 with a minimum of 100 minutes. So that's excuse me. Got a little hair there. That's very impressive. Now, obviously, Dumont points out that Belzile is not as necessarily as good as some of the players he is surpassing with that number, but that it's still impressive all the same. Ian Boisvert has sung the praise of Denis Gurianov and posited that he may be useful on power play too. Also, on the latest episode of The Build, which is episode 41, Boisvert talked about the pro scouting team that the Canadiens have and why it's important. And I found that to be a fascinating discussion. So I urge you to listen to that episode. Over on the Habby Hour, Veronica pointed out that after the Colorado game, that in her estimation, the grief and misdirected anger that had been pointed at Artturi Lehkonen during his time at in Montreal finally may have ebbed and instead been replaced with appreciation. So that's a good thing. And, if he was treated unfairly, if he's getting his respect now that he's gone, it's still better late than never, I guess. On Habs Unfiltered, they have been pointed out that Riley Kidney's averaging 2 goals a game, which is, Kidney has actually fallen sort of out of the it has not been getting as much attention as a lot of the other prospects, even though he is getting, two goals a game. So it was good they pointed that out. Scott Matla in his reporting covered the game where the Laval Rocket lost 2-0 and dropped out of a playoff spot, and things are really tightening up in that in the chase to get into the playoffs. So Laval does not want to, tempt fate there. A very interesting statistic was talked about on the Habby Hour, or it's not a statistic, it's a piece of information. David O'Shea brought it up, and it's actually MissoSoupe on Twitter posted this, and it pointed out the last 40, 50 goal scorers in the last 90 and 100-point scores in Montreal history. And that was put in a tweet, and I'll link to that in the show notes. And just pointing out, just of those, the last 50 goal scorer was Stefan Richer in 1989-90, and the last 100-point season was Mats Naslund in 1985-86. And you can look at the tweet for the 40 goal scorer and 90-point seasons, and they came in the early 90s, and so the Canadiens really could use some superstar talent to get that sort of production. And Cole Caulfield was trending that way before he got injured, but he got injured. Also, in what the Canadiens are still playing for, us on the Happy Hour, Beth reminded us that the Canadiens still have a chance to defeat the Leafs in the season series. And the worst that can happen is the Canadiens tie, but the Habs can still win the series. And I think that's an important still moral victory that can be won. Turning to some articles that came out. The excellent Blain Potvin wrote an article about how the Canadiens need to rebuild goaltending depth. And he said that none of the prospects in the system are a future NHL starter. And he's not the only one to have said that. And he wrote of some possible ways to fill that void. One option was on the free agent market, and he suggested it could be Semyon Varlamov, who has a criminal past, so I'm opposed to that on those grounds. But Potvin stayed on the ice with his points and mentioned, though, that Varlamov, due to his age, may only want to be with a contender, so he may not want to go to the Canadiens, who are rebuilding. So the problem may resolve itself without having to get into, his past, which is terrible. Also, Potvin pointed out Ilya Samsonov, who is 26, might fit in better with the rebuilding process that the Canadiens are going through. But Potvin also brought up a good point and said that he doesn't believe that there's anyone better with a reasonable cap hit than Jake Allen. So that's to be considered. In trading options, he believes that Carter Hart could be an instant upgrade, or Devin Levi. Now, Levi, of course, is unproven in the professional level, as he's still playing goal in Northeastern. Of course, his season just ended. But Carter Hart, of course, has played for the Flyers and is having a very good season this year, but has been inconsistent. Personally, I would not go for Hart. Just he is all right now, but what he just showed himself to not be necessarily reliable before. And I think the Canadiens need to get somebody who is more steady than that. If they're going to make a trade, if they're going to try to get somebody they want to be that rock in net, don't go with somebody who people had doubts about, and even if he had a good year right now. And I mean, Levi may be an answer as a top prospect. It's tricky because you don't know what you're getting per se, but if you make that pick, if you make that trade, at least you're getting a potential great player. But again, you don't know for sure you're getting a great player, so it's really a tough call. Potvin in his article also outlined some options if the Canadiens wanted to draft a goaltender. So I urge you to read that article and see what he had to say there. Potvin also had an interesting article about how the Canadiens need to solve their injury issues if they want to succeed. And this is, in one sense, this is an obvious point, but also he pushes back on this sort of like narrative that has come out of some fans that the Canadiens medical staff is at fault for all these injuries. And, Potvin points out, well, if the medical staff is failing, they wouldn't be having their jobs per se. And generally that is correct. I mean, most of the time, if the medical staff is incompetent, they wouldn't have their jobs. Now, there are exceptions. There are cases where people have kept their jobs while they're sucking at their jobs. It happens everywhere. But I would tend to agree with the logic, though, that it is very likely that that the Canadiens medical staff is doing their job. And Potvin talked to doctors and trainers to get their opinion on what was going on, and they didn't believe the Canadiens medical staff had done anything wrong. But Potvin's point was that that whatever they have to do, the Canadiens need to find ways to somehow lower the amount of injuries, and that may not, and that whatever that has to be, it whether it's just a changes in routine or something else, there just needs to be changes to make that happen. So that's an interesting article. I urge you to read that one as well. After the Penguins game, Brian Wilde had his recap, and there was just three quick points I wanted to make about that. The one thing was he had pointed out that Justin Barron's passing was excellent in the game, and that was not a point lost on many. That Byron seemed to be doing very well with the transition game in this game, using games twice there. Also, though, Wilde looked back at the Colorado game, and he had pointed out that the Avalanche defenders were good at being offensive, and he was saying how forwards need to be more defensive. And he felt that Byron, Mike Matheson, Caden Gooley were players that would be very good offensive defensemen. And the Canadiens had more players like that in the system, and that they would be able to, the more the Canadiens were able to adapt a system like Colorado's, the more successful they would be. And I found that to be an interesting point, an interesting take. And obviously Colorado has won the Stanley Cup last season, so it's not a bad idea to look to them for potential success. Also, Wilde made a point about the fan base, which I would suggest you take a look at, and so that'll be in the show notes. Then the last area I wanted to delve into is talking about prospects, because that's come up a lot. And there's a lot of writing about the prospects and some podcast discussion, and just obviously it's a big deal right now, especially as various European leagues are wrapping up, and the NCAA season is wrapping up as well. And so just starting off with Emil Heineman, Marco D'Amico pointed out that after the SHL playoffs in Sweden, he's already signed a contract with the Canadiens, so he can go to the Rocket. His team did lose, so he's expected to join the Rocket. Scott Matla on Locked On Canadiens said his heavy shot could help on the power play. D'Amico thought that he might possibly get a trip to Montreal, but it looks like it's going to be Laval as the destination. And and Patrick Belzile, who's an expert on European prospects, was talking about how the deal meant this deal he had signed meant he couldn't go to the AHL this year unless it was after the Swedish season was over. He could only go to the NHL or Sweden. So once he didn't go to the NHL, he had to go to Sweden. Bexell also had to say that his style suits American ice better than the larger European ice surface. And he mentioned that he mentioned that he has a wicked shot, and that they need to see where he gets lost in the defensive zone on the European ice, and work on that. And it's going to be faster in the NHL, so that's going to be a thing to adapt to. He doesn't have the hockey IQ of, say, an Arturi Lehkonen and others, as Bexell compared it, but I think Bexell's point was that he does have a competency, but that it's not as high as certain other players. And Bexell said on Locked On Canadiens that he shouldn't go to the NHL immediately. He should like next year, he should spend some time in the AHL. And I'm sort of rambling through a bunch of points that were made eloquently on the Locked On Canadiens podcast, which I suggest you listen to. That's his status right now. Turning to Sean Farrell, he is still in the NCAA. His Harvard's still playing this weekend. Marco D'Amico expects him to sign an entry-level contract either in late March or early April, depending on when the NCAA season wraps up. Marc Dumont noticed that he scored 2 goals and 2 assists in Harvard's 2-game sweep of Princeton in the earlier round of the ECAC playoffs. Dumont also describes him as being versatile in playing power play and penalty kill minutes, but he's evolved into a double threat from an offensive standpoint, keeping defensemen guessing as to his intentions, which creates time and space for his line mates. And Blain Potvin noted that Farrell has 20 goals and 51 points in only 31 games, which is 3rd overall in scoring across the entire NCAA. So Farrell has just been excellent all year, and I believe was nominated reached the top 10 list for the Hobey Baker nominees. Then we get to Jayden Struble, who attracted a lot of attention with signing with he signed with the Canadiens and he signed with the Rocket. The Canadiens contract does not start till next year. The AHL contract with the Rocket starts now. Scott Matla describes him as an agile, skating, physically gifted defender. Marco D'Amico says he has good offensive instincts, jumping into the rush at opportune times. However, he never quite unlocked his offensive potential in his time in the NCAA. He also describes him as his puck-moving abilities are good, though unlikely to easily translate to the professional level. Blain Potvin says he played a physical style with excellent mobility and confidence in moving the puck into transition. And He notes he does not have impressive offensive numbers, but he provided his club with leadership and a steadying hand on the blue line. And a few other analysis. Hadi Kalakeche says he argues, I'm quoting him, that Struble has more offensive upside than any defenseman currently with the Habs or Rocket. The movement he displays on and off the puck, the intelligence and subtlety of this puck distribution and poise, the way he fiercely jumps into plays and never settles for the first play he sees. The key word here is offensive upside. He's not going to step in and put up 50 points, nor is it guaranteed, but he's got the potential to become one of the best offensive transitioners in the NHL. So that's a quote there. At the same time, Byron Bader says he's no Lane Hutson, but Jayden Struble has some NHL potential, likely a mid-bottom rotation defender, something similar to Adam Pelech is a likely ceiling. So a lot of different opinions there. But needless to say, there's a lot of good points about him there. And Adam Pelech is he's a NHL regular. So I'm sure Struble would settle for NHL regular. And so it'll be interesting. Now, as Ian Boisvert noted on the build, there are already 9 players with NHL contracts for the Canadiens on D. So it may be hard for Struble to find a place in the NHL with already the log jam ahead of him. Then, speaking of defense, Lane Hutson. As Blain Potvin mentioned, he is not only the first defenseman to win the Hockey East scoring title, he's the first freshman to do so since Jack Eichel did. And obviously, Jack Eichel is a forward. The on Habs Unfiltered, they expect Hutson to sign when his season is over, which is interesting because he's a freshman, so he could come back for more seasons, but they're expecting him to sign. So that'll be very interesting. And Ian Boisvert, though, notes and warns that while he has a ton of offensive upside, he can't be asked to play like a Joel Edmondson because of his size. So there's that. Hutson is also on the top 10 list of Hobey Baker nominees, and he's just had an incredibly impressive season at BU. Jacob Dobes, and I'm not certain on the pronunciation there, is the goaltender at Ohio State. And in Potvin's words, he's one of the top goaltenders to ever play for Ohio State. But he's Habs Unfiltered believes he's going to go back to the NCAA. Adam Engstrom is in Europe, and according to Patrick Rexell, his hockey IQ is enormous. His offensive upside is due to not having the same skills as, say, Matthias Norlander, because he has to, quote, trust the system, play his vision. He knows when to take a shot. So his skating is real good, and his defensive acumen is there. So just a really smart player, but doesn't have the skill set of some, but makes up for it. And Bexell says he doesn't need to rush over from Europe. He can play over there and develop. And considering what the log jams that there are in the Canadian system, that's probably for the best. Just some final points. Frederick Diekoff is a goaltender who is questionable in terms of what he brings. Bexell thinks he's making progress, sees a weakness in his rebound control, though. As it should be noted that at the moment, I would believe that he probably wouldn't figure into Blain Potvin's view of what the system of who is an NHL ready goalie. So he have to work on that to make himself more or prepared. So it's we don't necessarily know what we have in Diekoff. And last but not least, Philip Machar. According to Marco D'Amico, he could join the Rocket after the OHL season concludes. He's had an up and down season, playing for a team that is not necessarily the best team for him to be on, but I guess he's doing his best. But so he still might get a shot with the Rocket, depending on the timing, and that will be interesting. So Canadians now are going to be facing Tampa next, which is not the greatest team to be facing after you got beaten 9-5. But who knows what they'll come up with, because they've been an unpredictable team, and hopefully they'll be full of surprises. So that's all.